Let's review Pesachim Daf Pevav. The Gemara is continuing to analyze the halacha that Rav said that Gagin and Aliyos were not Kodesh in the Azara or in Yerushalayim. The Gemara challenges Rav's halacha from a Mishnah, from a Brisa that quotes Abba Shaul, who says that the Aliyah, the attic above the Beis Kodesh HaKodeshim, had even a higher level of Kedusha than the Kodesh Kodeshim itself. For the Kodesh Kodeshim was only accessed once a year on Yom Kippur, but the attic on top of the Kodesh HaKodeshim was accessed less frequently. The Gemara says that the attic on top of the Beis Kodesh HaKodeshim is different, because that was specifically itemized in the drawings, in the description of how exactly the Beis HaMikdash has to be built, that was given from the Rebbeinu Shalom to David, that was passed on to Shlomo. And the pasuk says, "Akol b'ksav miyad Hashem alai hiskil." That had to be precisely the way the Rebbeinu Shalom gave it over to David HaMelech, which included that aliyah, the aliyah of the Beis Kodesh HaKodeshim, had a kedusha. The Gemara then discusses if there's tunnels or rooms that are physically in the Azara, but the access to them is out of the Azara. We always say that the room has the same level of kedusha as the room that accesses it. So wherever the door opens to, that area, whatever kedusha that area has, that's going to be the kedusha of inside that room. However, the Gemara brings a brisa that says that the roof of that room, even though it's in the Azara, it will have a kedusha. The problem is, Rav said that roofs in the Azara do not have a kedusha. The Gemara says that being that there was elevation differences between the different areas in the Azara, and from the Azara to Har HaBayis, it's possible to have a room that's at ground level on Har HaBayis, and the room goes into the Azara, but in the Azara, it's actually below grade, and its roof will be at the same level as the grade of the Azara, and that's why that Gag would have the Kedusha of the Azara, because in fact, from the Azara's perspective, it's not a Gag at all, it's the main floor. The Gemara tells us that there were exceptions to this rule that the Gag had no Kedusha, because Rabbi Yehuda tells us that the Gag of the Heichel had Kedusha. However, it's not the real Kedusha of an Azara. And two examples of what the real Kedusha of an Azara is A, you can eat Kodesh HaKodeshim there, and B is you can shecht all Karbanos there, including Kodeshim Kalim. In fact, you were not able to do those things on the roof of the Heichel. The Kedusha that Rabbi Yehuda is referring to is a different type of Kedushas that you can store certain important utensils there. The Gemara gives an example of a different area, which was over the Mizrach entrance. It was a place that was called Shushan Abira, where they kept different size measuring sticks. And so too, in the roof of the Heichel, or the Aliyah of the Heichel, that area had a Kedusha. They were able to store certain items there, but it didn't have the same Kedusha as the Heichel itself. Now, these measuring sticks were a little bit larger than an amma. And the reason why they had these is when people were contracted to do work for the Beis HaMikdash, in order to make sure that they delivered at least what the contract required, they always delivered more than an amma. So for every amma that they obliged themselves to build, they build a little bit more than an amma. Now, if it was something like block, it would be a little bit more than an amma. But if it was something like gold they were working with, it would just be a tiny bit more than the amma, because we can't expect the trades that service the Beis HaMikdash to be providing so much extra gold or silver. It's very, very expensive. The Gemara then tells us that windows and the tops of the walls, where the Mishnah said all have Kedushas Azara, the window would have to be, if the bottom of the window was parallel to the floor of the Azara, then it can have the Kedusha of the Azara. And the top of the wall that we were talking about is, we're speaking about a short wall that would go to, instead of staircases. So if you have a wall at the bottom of the stairs, that top surface is at the same height as the top of the stairs, it acts like a railing wall, so that top of the wall is actually parallel to the floor on the higher elevation, and that's why it could have the Kedusha of the Azara. The Mishnah then tells us about how the Korban Pesach must be eaten. And the Mishnah tells us that a Korban Pesach can be split into two chaburas. You can have one Korban Pesach that's eaten even in two houses by two different chaburas. However, no individual is allowed to eat the Korban Pesach in two places. Wherever you started eating it, that's where you have to finish eating it. So, for instance, if a shamus was manning the barbecue, and he took a bite of the Korban Pesach, now he's stuck there. That's where he has to eat whole Korban Pesach. So he'd have to be there by himself the whole time unless other people wanted to join him. But he wouldn't be able to now sit by the table and eat the Korban Pesach because he's already started eating the Korban Pesach right at the roasting place. The Mishnah also tells us that a kala is allowed to turn towards another direction when she eats, even though it's like she's joining a different chabura, and that's because of tznius. She's embarrassed to be eating when people are watching her. The Gemara tells us that there's actually a two-way machlokes. Our Mishnah that said these two halachas, that a chabura, you can have two chaburas on one Korban Pesach that can be eaten in two different houses, and the halacha is that one person may not eat here and then transfer, that actually is disputed by Reb Shimon. So our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. Reb Shimon holds exactly the opposite. One person can eat in different places. However, you're not allowed to split up a Korban Pesach to two chaburas. And it all hinges on how to understand two psukim. The first pasuk is, it says, V'lakchu min adam, v'zarku, v'nos noch shtem mezuzos, and it says, Al habotim asher yoichlu oisei bahem, which means the korban could be eaten in multiple botim. That's how Rabbi Yehuda learns it. The korban could be eaten in multiple botim, and therefore one korban can have two chaburas in two different places. While Rabbi Shimon learns that this means a person eating the korban can eat the korban in one house and then continue eating the same korban in a different house. He's allowed to move from place to place. The next pasuk is Bevayis echod yeyachel loisotzi min habayis min habasar chutza. Rabbi Yehuda learns this as yesh em l'mesaris. The word is spelled Yud Aleph Chaf Lamed, which he pronounces Yoichal, which indicate that it's referring to a person. B'bayis echad Yoichal, a person may only eat the korban in one place. Rav Shimon learns it's B'bayis echad Yeyachel Yeshem Lemikra, and the pasuk is referring to the korban itself. The korban may only be eaten in one house by one chabura. The Gemara then discusses what would be if people were eating it in one room as one chabura, and the wall collapsed in between and now separated those two rooms, or vice versa. If there was a partition in the room which then fell down, would this be considered like it's two chaburas when the wall falls down, or when the wall gets removed, would it be considered like a person is moving from one area to another area and eating it? So the Gemara says, according to Rav Ashi, it was a suffix. According to Rav Kahana, it seemed to have been a vadai. Then the Gemara discusses the kala who's allowed to turn away because she's embarrassed. The Gemara relates a story of Rav Huna who came to the home of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. They asked him his name. He called himself Rav Huna. He introduced himself as Rav Huna. The Gemara tells us he did that not because he wanted to show that he's a rabbi, but that's what he was called since he's been a little child. That really was his name. They also had him sit in a very, very makavadik place on the Puria. And the reason why he accepted that honor is because Kol Masha Omolach Balabais Asay. Then they offered him a kos of wine, and he took it without refusing it, because Ein Mesarvan Begadol. He drank it in two sips, because if you drink the whole thing in one sip, it's a gargaron, and if you drink it in three sips, it's a gaiva. Drinking it in two sips is the right way. And he didn't turn to the side to sort of conceal his eating, because he said the Mishnah only says a kala does that. A regular person doesn't need to do that. The Gemara then says a similar story about Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yossi, who came to Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi Yossi's house. They gave him a kos, and he drank it all in one shot. They asked him, why would you drink it in one shot? Isn't that a gargaron? So he said, there's an exception if it's a small kos and it's sweet, and you have a big stomach that can handle it, then you're allowed to drink it in one gulp. And that's why he drank it in one gulp. Then the Mishnah tells us about how you contract with waiters. If you hire a waiter to run your meal for you, and let's say you hired him for 3 hours, you still have to you have to allow him to serve everybody at once, which means until there's at least 3 people there, he doesn't have to start serving if one person comes a little earlier. He only has to start serving once there's at least 3 people there. However, if certain people end earlier and certain people end up remaining later, there he has to serve even individuals who stay on later. However, Rabbah said that this only applies if they're still within the original time frame, A, and B is when they hired him, they told him that certain individuals are going to end up remaining later, and he accepted that as part of his contract. Ravina says, in addition to that, as everyone leaves, they have to pay him, and the person who stays last has to give him even extra pay. But the Gemara says that we don't paskin like Ravina. And with that, we were zoicha to finish the 7th parak of Pesachim, Hadron Aloch Ketzat Tzeilen.